Good afternoon. I hope you've just been enjoying the session with Jeff Speck, and we are keeping our American denouement to the end of our third day of the conference. I am delighted and very proud to have Charles Marohn join us from. Where precisely are you joining us from in the States, Charles? Are you in Minnesota?
Yes, I am. I'm in Minnesota.
L'Étoile du Nord.
Yeah, I'm in my hometown of Brainerd, which is a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's if you look at a map, you'll see the Great Plains come across the Dakotas, the kind of Iowa cornfields come north, and then the Canadian forest comes down, and we're kind of right where all that meets. So it's a very nice area, and maybe you'll come visit someday. That would be delightful.
I'd love to. And can I be very naughty? So your name, is that a German or Scandinavian name in origin? Because I know there's a lot of people from those parts of Europe.
Yes,
populated that state, didn't they?
Exactly. I am 3/4 Norwegian, but the Marohn happens to be German. So yes,
that might be. It's a lucky guess. Listen, enough of this. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you. Now, it is fashionable, and not entirely unreasonably so. It is fashionable to be rude about social media these days, and there's a lot of good reasons to be. But I actually first encountered Charles and the marvelous not-for-profit that he runs, Strong Towns. And for those of you who don't know it, I recommend you look it up. I do hope you're all taking notes. strongtowns.org, I think that's right. If I recall correctly, I first encountered Strong Towns a few years ago in a tweet, a picture of a reviving American Main Street, and note my use of American, not English, Main Street, not High Street. And I followed the tweet because it chimed in some way, and I found a marvelous cornucopia of writing and ideas on the Strong Town website, and subsequently in articles and in books. And the founder and the president, because you always have presidents in the States, not chairman or directors, the founder and president of Strong Towns is Charles Marohn from Minnesota, 3/4 Norwegian, 1/4 German, as we've just learned. He's far from the sole author, but I will call him the presiding genius. Maybe he would cavil at that. Now, the Strong Towns website says that Charles is known as Chuck to his friends and colleagues. And that's a very American sobriquet. I'm not sure I can quite cope with that deep here in England. Just so you don't get confused, there's his Minnesota Twins mug, and I've got a Union Jack mug, so you don't need to be in any doubt as to which is the English or American end of this conversation. Now, Charles is the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. Here's my copy, obviously inverted by the camera. More of that in a moment. He is a professional engineer. He's also a professional land use planner with 2 decades of experience. So you don't look like you have 2 decades, Charles, far too young for that. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master of urban and regional and planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Now, Charles, you describe the Strong Towns philosophy, and I'm quoting here, as a radically new way of thinking about the way we build our world. The reality of towns that have been left behind, of towns that are prosperous, is a very, very live issue in British politics at the moment. It's very pertinent to the election success of the current government in the last election. Not all our listeners will be familiar with what I will call the Strong Towns philosophy. Perhaps as an opening question, could I just ask you just to perhaps explain a bit about the core of what Strong Towns is as an institution, and what you think and what you believe. And I'll dive down into some of the items you'll get to, but just a sort of an overview to start with, if that's okay. Absolutely.
Thank you. And, we're kind of in like the blue shirt club, I noticed, as we got going. I love your style. Strong Towns started out as a blog back in 2008. And I started writing about projects that I had worked on as an engineer, as a planner, largely from a financial standpoint. One of the things that I had experienced was that the cities that I was working with were growing very, very quickly. We were doing a lot of projects, building a lot of infrastructure. And all these projects were being sold as a way to create jobs, to grow the tax base, with kind of the idea that we would all be better off. We'd be more prosperous. We would be able to do more stuff. We would have lower taxes, better returns, a more prosperous place. The problem with that narrative is that these places I was working with were not experiencing that at all. The taxes were going up. The debt levels were going up. They were having, problems with employment. And this is before we hit housing crisis. This is before we hit the 2008 financial, difficulties. And so I started to look at the projects that we were working on, We get paid as engineers, as planners, to basically process things. We're gonna build a road. We're gonna build a bridge. We're going to, do this housing development, and that becomes our focus. And the finances of that become almost mechanical. Where do we get the money? How do we do? Where do we get the capital to be able to do this? I started to ask some different questions about what are the implications of this for us long term. And the core understanding that Strong Town's founded with, that is still core to what we talk about today, is that it is very easy for us to grow as cities, as communities, as countries, if we are willing to sacrifice our financial stability and our financial strength and well-being over the long term. When we go out and put in that new bridge, or put in that new roadway or housing development, we can experience that growth today, and that will have all kinds of financial benefits for us. But we have taken on, as a community now, an eternal obligation to go out and fix that bridge when it needs repairs, to maintain that road when it falls apart, to fix that pipe when it goes bad. And that obligation becomes due regardless of how good of use we've made of that actual investment. If we build a road, and I actually worked on a project just like this, we built a half-mile long road that was supposed to have all these houses on it, and the development failed, and then failed again, and then failed again. And if you went out there today, there's 2 houses on it. Every year, the city has to plow the snow off the road and mow the ditches and fix the cracks and fill the potholes. And eventually they'll have to go out and repair it, even though there's no money coming in to compensate the community for that cost. And so at Strong Towns, we just started with this notion that you have to be financially solvent in order to do good. If you as a community are trying to do a project, you have to be solvent in order to make that happen. And our cities are not. And
what does that mean? Sorry to cut across
You're
for
good.
a second, but just to, in terms of the types of places that we create and who creates them and how we create them, and also perhaps just sort of comparing back to the past. I was very struck in your book by the example you give, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, I think of your hometown of Brainerd in Minnesota, of how that used to grow and of how that grows now. And I think, I know that amongst those watching and who will watch this session, there'll be lots of people who work in local government. And it was a really striking example, which perhaps I could just ask you just to make that contrast.
I would be happy to.
Thank you very much indeed.
I spent a lot of time trying to understand this, because one of the conclusions early on in Strong Towns was that our cities are all like, we actually call it a Ponzi scheme, this idea of growing today and taking on these long-term liabilities. And so I started looking around going, well, we're here and I live in a city and the city is here. How did the city get here and make it to this point if it's broke? Like what happened? And if you go back and look at the very early days, not just of my community, but really any city that was, ever existed prior to, really the post-World War II experiment in this new way of building. If you look at them, what you see is they all started with a very small investments. People would move to, in the case of my town, would move here to the middle of the woods in northern Minnesota. There was a train stop here, and so they got off and they cut down the trees that were here and they planed out the wood and they put up these little pop-up shacks. There was a little pop-up shack settlement south of here. There was another one a little ways north of here. Those both failed. They went away. Mine, for whatever reason, worked out. People here came together and figured out whatever needed to figure out to make it viable. And what you saw is this growth pattern based on people coming together. The city would incrementally grow up, incrementally grow out, and incrementally becoming more intense. As the land became more valuable, it would create this kind of natural redevelopment pressure. And over time, you would get these more substantial buildings and then more substantial buildings. And you would have kind of an organic model of a city happening. This is the traditional city. And we can look at cities all over the world and see this exact same incremental organic approach.
And is that what you mean when you speak of a complex adaptive system growing incrementally and learning through experimentation?
It's It's interesting because a lot of this is a trade-off. It's a dance between the risk taking and the kind of stable part, the entrepreneurial part, the part that's trying new things, and the part that you can think of as like a community obligation. Like this is stable. This is the kind of way that all complex adaptive systems work. If you think of a rainforest, rainforests don't have kind of a pattern that is imposed on them. It has emergent qualities that come about from all these independent interactions. If you think of, in contrast to a rainforest, something like a cornfield is very ordered, very precise, but it lacks the adaptability, the feedback internally. When we look at cities prior to, in the US in particular, cities prior to the Great Depression functioned more like rainforests. They were emergent. Things would start small, start to grow, and really there was kind of an internal feedback loops. This complex feedback system that would drive that next step of innovation. Today, when we build cities, we build them very much from the top down. It's very ordered, very static, and I think to our detriment, designed not to adapt. Designed not to change. The kind of defining characteristic of post-World War II development is when we build things, we build it now in large blocks and we build to a finished state. We actually believe that what we build will never change. It is done and complete. And no human civilization prior to the modern era ever believed that about their places.
What I think is so fascinating about your work, Charles. Chuck is very hard for me to say.
Most of my European friends use Charles, and I'm very used to it. And I know it's easier off the tongue for Europeans for some reason.
Thank you. Let's keep on the intellectual stuff. So I'm sorry for distracting. What I find is particularly fascinating is, we are, I think, I hope we are at an inflection point in how we think about where we live and how we live. And the change in how we think about what we build and the way that the finances are run, I think, goes to the heart of that. So, I mean, I guess let's look forward. So let's take that. And so if today, in 2020, we come to COVID specifically later, but if a city or a town council was to start thinking in these ways, practically, what would they do differently? I note in your book you say cities should run a profit. And that leads them to behave differently. Maybe that's another way of putting the same question. I don't know. But, you're mayor of your town. What do you start doing differently, given all the legal and regulatory requirements you're ineluctably under?
It's a beautiful question. I think the first core insight is that we have had 7+ decades, nearly 8 decades of rapid growth and expansion. Building roads, building sewer, building water, building infrastructure, and all this horizontal expansion of our cities, we can go back and look and see it's not very productive. Financially, it's not very productive. We don't make very good use of this land. There's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of, a lot of expense and not much wealth that's been created. And so the first thing that I do as a mayor, as a town councilor, as what have you, is I stop building more of this stuff.
So sorry to interrupt. It's a physical answer about just not going out, as opposed to a procedural answer. You just change the way the city physically builds things. Sorry to cut across.
Yes, I am not going to add to my inventory one more foot of sidewalk, of roadway, of pipe, because I don't have the tax base to maintain the stuff I already have. Why would I add? It's like I have a house and I'm unable to maintain the house. And so next year I go and put an addition on my house. Like that doesn't make any sense. I actually have to come up with the wealth to take care of what I have. And so the first thing I do is I stop adding more. Don't add any more road to the inventory. The second question I have.
What's the second thing you do? I was about to ask. Thank you.
Yeah. The second question that I have is, how do we get better use out of what we have? How do we take what we have? So we have a mile of roadway. That roadway has a certain cost to it and has a certain tax base to it. How do we, with that same cost, increase our tax base? How do we get more out of it? And planners like to talk about this in terms of infill. Let's go in and in the gaps in between buildings, let's fill things in. I think that that's a little rote and limited in thinking. What we actually have to think about is how do we get these places to adapt and respond and actually become wealthier over time in a way that is naturally regenerative. And when you start asking those questions, there's issues of regulation, there's issues of finance, there's issues of maintenance, there's issues of architecture in place that all come into play. But what it is, and you mentioned earlier, it's a radical new vision. It's focusing on a different set of metrics. Instead of the metric of just sheer growth, how do we grow more? How do we add more? The metric becomes a more refined one of how do we get a better return out of our investments? How do we get more out of what we are collectively trying to do together?
And how would you measure that? Is that a financial return, or is that because in some of the earlier conversations we've had as part of this conference, we've talked about the social capital. Probably social capital is I think, frankly, it's something you can count in so many different ways. You can certainly skew it to get the answer you want. How should a town mayor or a town council be measuring that return on their investment?
It's very interesting because my thoughts on this have changed over time. When I first started writing for Strong Towns, I was very much in the engineer planner mindset. And in trying to solve this problem and come up with this, I came up with what I now call the Singapore model. And I don't want to, dig around in stereotypes, but from America, if we look at Singapore, we think of a place that is very technically managed, very, very thoughtful people, sitting down and calculating every, accounting for every bean and every, expenditure, and have spreadsheets and everything's, and I looked at that and I thought, well, we could do this way. We could sit down and calculate the return on investment of every project. And we could, do all this math and all these calculations. I started to realize after a while that, first of all, that's just not how humans work. I mean, it's just not how we do things. We're not wired to respond that way. And then when I looked around the United States and I would talk to mayors and I would talk to city council members and I would, reflect on my own time in working with governments, this is not how we made decisions at all. If you look historically, what people did is they didn't sit down and do rote math. They copied systems that they knew worked. Yep. And so what we've tried to do is reduce this down to basically heuristics that if we copy these, we will end up in a better place. And I think the number one heuristic for building places that are financially productive is if you are building places scaled to people, if at the end of the day, you see what we call our indicator species, if our indicator species of the human is present in your place, you tend to have a place that's more financially productive than not. And so the more we focus on the human and the human experience in a place, the more wealth we're building and the more productive financially we're going to become.
This is so fascinating. So there are themes of, not building more liabilities in the long term. There's themes of making sure that we build things that are adaptable, resilient, flexible, a very, very timely conversation. There's not being afraid to copy. Just to sort of push the practicalities one stage further. So Create Streets and Onward are partners on this conference. We pushed a policy idea a few days ago, which got some pickup in the national media. And I think it chimes actually with something that comes out of your work, which is when we look round British towns and look at some of the civic buildings that were built, I'll say 100 years ago, but probably up to about 80 years ago, most of them are not built to the cheapest cost possible. They clearly had money and love lavished on them. Right. In society, it was actually poorer than the one we live in now. When you look at, and I have the process for, contracting a public building today, it's basically spend as little money as possible because anything else is a waste of the taxpayers' money. So you end up with something that is ugly drive to outside the town centre and does not speak to the inhabitants of, name your town, of what it is to be from this place and to have pride in this place. Presumably, if you were taking this approach, you wouldn't build the cheapest building you could off on the outskirts, but you'd take a more resilient long-term approach. Or am I putting words into your mouth?
No, you're not at all. It's interesting because I think that if I went back to my engineering days, I very much would have empathized or felt a kinship to the people who would just build the utilitarian building out on the edge of town. Like we're building a city hall. Why does this need to be fancy? Let's just do that. When I look around my city, and it's even more apparent when I have visited the UK. When I look around just my city, when we built our most magnificent buildings, we were ridiculously poor. We built our gorgeous county courthouse, not with any grant money or anything like that. Like we collectively put our money together and built Roman columns and all this at the end of a street in the 1930s during the depths of the Great Depression. And I pondered this. I sat and I asked myself, like, why would we have done this? And it really struck me one day. I was going by with my daughter, who at the time was 4 years old. And she said, "Dad, what is that building?" And she pointed to the courthouse. And I said, "Honey, what do you think that building is?" And she looked at it. She said, "Dad, I think it's a church." I pointed to the new courthouse, which is built with a big parking lot and like a suburban campus kind of thing. And, not good architecture, very utilitarian. And I pointed to that one and I said, "Chloe, what do you think that one is?" And she said, "Well, I think that's a Target." And a Target is like a department store for us. It's like a big box generic department store. And it occurred to me that what our ancestors were doing, and we see this around the world, is that they were building a building that, yes, you use words about, I can't remember exactly how you phrase it, but like pride in the community and all that. What they were doing is they were building a structure that was a billboard for their success, that was going to radiate wealth to everything around it. I live on 4th Street in Brainerd. At the end of 4th Street, at the very termination point, is the courthouse. When I walk out my house and I look left, about 7 blocks away is this beautiful, magnificent building. Guess what else is on 4th Street? All the old, nice homes are on 4th Street. And why did they locate there? Because that was kind of like the nicest street in town, because you had this beautiful view of the building and it said something about who we were. It was an advertisement for like, you can take us seriously, even though we're in the middle of the woods, the North Woods in the middle of Minnesota. We're a real place with real people. And it was like a billboard for our, success.
I think this is absolutely fascinating. And again, just to draw a British analogy for our viewers, so what's so interesting here is a lot of this does, I think, rhyme for us. If you look at the creation of British towns and cities, it was a little bit older, but the great age of British town creation was the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and exactly the same pattern. I know happened, whereby local markets would be set up. Some would work, and some would fail, and the ones that work would grow with some urban regulation, but essentially grew within that pattern book. And clearly, we had the same pattern or a comparable pattern of creation of civic buildings that were meant to endure. Now,
can I point out one quick thing though? I feel like this is the important thing. If you go in those British towns and you walk around and you ask yourself, these were very poor people. Why would they do this? Like, why would they take like limited resources and do this? And I think, you can conclude that they were very different people with very different ethics and very different morals. Or you can read the Bible and recognize that like we've been the same people for thousands of years. Forget the hypothesis that these people were radically different. They were very similar to us with similar motivations. What were they doing? They were building a place where they were taking the limited resources they have and squeezing the most out of it. And that's what that pattern does. That's what building in that way does, is it actually, when you look at it, just from a pure financial standpoint, those types of neighborhoods have the most value per square foot, the most value per area, as you're going to find compared to anything we've built in the last 80 years.
And interestingly, because Great Streets have done some analysis on this, what we find in the UK is that when you have historic town centres like that, if you like, that have survived the 20th century, and have seen what I'll call the urban renaissance, which is not something that's happened across the UK, that is true. where they've been denuded of their role and drained of local employment, and if you like, not revived, as I know is the case in many American town centres, they remain empty and underinvested in. Can I just? Sorry,
I don't know if that's. Let me give you a parallel to here, and I don't know about the UK. I've not seen these numbers, but I can tell you that in the analysis that we have done, even when we go to cities where their core is very poor, been disinvested in, even when we look at some of the poorest neighborhoods, when you actually calculate how much it costs to provide service and sustain that area, and you contrast that with the tax base and the wealth that has been created and the revenue that the community would get as a whole for having that place, even when it's blighted, even when it's run down, those core downtowns are vastly more productive, have a higher return on investment than any of the new stuff that we've built.
Yeah, I'm sure that's
not
true.
even close.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that is true. I didn't mean it in quite those terms, but I'm sure that is correct. In all, if not all, most of that. Allow me just to move sideways, because I think I want to sort of angle this in a way that will be helpful for as many as our viewers as possible. I was very struck by something you wrote, or someone working for you wrote recently, which allow me to quote. Local government is not the lowest form of government in an ecosystem of governments, but the highest form of coordination and advocacy for your community. Again, keeping the conceit that you're the mayor of a town and that you've decided to change your way of working to achieve some of these aims of resilience and flexibility over time, and to cease to sort of grow your liability base. How do you interact differently with residents? And how do you interact differently with central government? That's how we think in those terms. You'll probably mean state government and federal government in your context. How does that relationship change if you're thinking of local government differently?
Yeah, I feel like this is really applicable to you as well. It's interesting. So much of our growth economy has positioned cities as the bottom of this food chain. So policies will get passed at the central level and will get handed down to the local level, essentially as implementation. And so here in the US, our local governments have set themselves up and designed themselves internally so that they have people who are working with the federal government to get grants and get money, working with the state government to access programs that they have, working with Wall Street to get capital brought in through the private sector to invest in developments and growth. And what happens is you wind up with this vertical orientation where people are looking at these capital flows saying, how do we position ourselves to meet those? Right now, the number one thing that my city is working on is a new children's museum. Why a children's museum? Of all the things that we could be doing, why that one? Because there's a state grant for children's museums. So all of a sudden, children's museum is like the prime issue. Instead of orienting vertically, if we orient horizontally and ask some deep questions about where people in our community are actually struggling to use the city as it's been built, and that's the way we frame it. How do people struggle to use this city as it has been created? And then we try to respond to those things, not with some huge solution, permanent, top-down big project, but we actually go out and try to, and I like to point out, using cones and straw bales and paint and just see what we can respond to it by trying things out and seeing, does this make this a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better? What we find is that we can make very small investments in terms of dollar amounts, but have them lead to this iterative process of learning from where people are actually having a difficult time. And at the end of the day, those become very high return investments that actually improve people's lives. Now, all of a sudden, we can turn around and be advocates very in touch with the struggles and the needs of people in the community, as opposed to trying to sell the community on the next project that is being handed down and delivered to us.
Fascinating. It is. You said that we're the same as the people who walked this planet in the centuries before. I have to say, what you describe, I'm sure many people watching will recognise that so perfectly. Credit Suisse is right now helping various local councils, do their latest bid for this or that. It's a absolutely almost identical situation, and actually, it's a theme that's come up. We had a conversation with Bruce Katz a couple of days ago, and one of our breakout sessions was looking at, at northern towns and how they're performing. It's almost a precise analogy for the conversation.
It's funny, but you guys have had this debate about, and your last election was, the rural areas are left behind. How do we funnel more into rural areas, right? How do we funnel more into these?
Well, less rural is left behind has become the phrase.
Left behind.
It was essentially areas that, I'm going to simplify a bit here, but essentially were the victims of deindustrialization in the 1970s and 80s, and again with some exceptions, have struggled to find the same level of prosperity or employment as they historically had. And again, the challenge has been, I'd be interested to have your thoughts on this, many of the 19th century towns or industrial villages are where they are because of what was either under the ground, coal, or, for example, because of their proximity to water, which was obviously the cheap way to transport things, in the 19th century. And I think the challenge has been, in a way, Britain faces south and faces towards Europe, and the places that are well positioned for land transport or for communications in that direction have tended to prosper over the last 80 years. So that's been the sort of historical challenge that I don't think any British government in the last two generations has managed to rise to.
I think what you're dealing with there is this growth and stability trade-off. And so we've had the same thing, here in Minnesota, we are on the Great Lakes, we are Lake Superior, and, coal, shipping and deindustrialization along the entire Great Lakes. And what we see is that how we tried to address that, it's not that these places were left behind in like they didn't get their share of the capital. But what they got is they got the latest fad program. We went in and said, okay, you're struggling. Here's a bridge. You're struggling. Here's a big project that we can do. And those types of things actually did deep damage to our communities, because not only did they load them up with liabilities, but they didn't actually respond to the urgent struggles that people had. And I feel like when I hear your, when I read your stuff and I read about that conversation you're having about places left behind, if the answer is we're just going to redirect the budget so you get more pork barrel projects, you get more capital spending coming out of London or what have you, as opposed to we're going to help you create a different system where your cities can internally build strength. And yes, we will support that. But your cities would be way better off instead of having, in dollar terms, instead of having $1 million project, having 10, $20,000 projects. You'd be far better off with the 10 smaller projects. The way you solve that problem, though, in a top-down system is you just pour money into big projects. And that's not good for places left behind. It really isn't.
I think you've just put your finger perfectly on one of the big challenges that this government needs to get right in the months and years to come. I do hope that there are civil servants and MPs watching. If not, we shall certainly send this video to them. Now, we started 5 minutes late, so although the thing is telling us time is up, Charles, if you're okay, we'll just go for 5 more minutes. I hope that's okay for our
the sun is just coming up here.
Sun's just coming up. Thank you for getting up early for us. People aren't all dying off, so we still got our audience. We'll just be 5 more minutes. But I promise we won't overrun our allotted slot beyond that 5 minutes. I promise. So I press pause on that bit of the conversation. Though I'd love to dive further, but I think we've got to. We agree, and we've got, I think, a really clear bit of advice there. I hope for the British government and those who are criticising and working with them. Allow me just to come to sort of a final range of questions, which again is one of the themes of the conference. And how could it not be this year, which obviously is COVID and the pandemic. And what are your thoughts and observations on how the experience of COVID might change our governance of towns and cities? Have you got any horror stories or any opportunities for hope and flexibility? Are you half empty or half full on this?
I'm of mixed mind, because I do think that the one thing that we have created is a lot of desperation. Our response here in the U.S. From the parts of it that have been top down have been very clumsy. And I think clumsy is a generous word, but let's go with that. They've been very clumsy, and I think it's left a sense of it's left a vacuum, in a sense, a leadership vacuum of direction. Where do we go? What does the future look like? And anytime you have the level of instability you have that you have here in this country, this big giant economy with all this unknown and instability, it does create tension that keeps me up at night and makes me nervous. On the other hand, filling that void and filling it in heroic fashion are local leaders all over the country. We have run a continuous series of stories just documenting and demonstrating things that local people are doing, both in government and in just civic society, stepping up to help people get fed, help people get shelter, help start local gardens so you can grow some local food resiliency, helping people with mental health and getting out in parks and changing streets over so people can make better use of public space when they're locked at home. We have seen the most heroic things happen at the local level. And so part of me is optimistic in the sense that I think even if things don't work out in other, at the federal level, at the state level, our local governments are starting to wake up and realize they have power and they can assert that and do lots of good with it. But the other side is that there might be some pain in that transition that's not going to be fun.
And do you think we're going to go back to normal?
No, there's no.
What will change? What will stay the same, and what will have changed a few years hence because of this?
It's hard to say. I do sense that we are getting to a breaking point on both the growth economy, just the idea that if things slow down, let's just print money, throw money at things. Let's just try to prop up exactly what we've been doing. I think what our economy has been telling us really since the 80s, when we had an S&L crisis, and then we had a dot-com crisis, and then we had a housing crisis, and now we're having this big, everything financial crisis, is that we need to actually correct the underlying mechanisms of our economy. I feel like we've been getting that signal, and every time we get it, we push back harder and say, no, we won't take that feedback. No. And I think we're getting to the end of that. At least it feels that way to me. And so I think the thing that is not going to go back to normal is that we're not going to, I think, accept at the local level just the incompetence or allow that to stand. I think local leaders are stepping up and just not going to, I think accept incompetence maybe is the best way to put it.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
We're going to fill that leadership void.
So last, this is brilliant. I would so love to go on for another 20 minutes, but we will get into trouble. Where do you think, and I'll have to ask you to keep this brief, I fear, where do you think will be towns and cities in the US and perhaps in Europe 20 years hence? Where do you think, how will they be different? How will they be the same?
I think 20 years, what we will see is, just the math dictates that our cities are going to be geographically smaller. The experience that you see in Detroit, where, Detroit's really the earliest adopter here in North America of this rapid horizontal expansion. And what you see is essentially a consolidation of that. There's too much stuff and not enough wealth. And Detroit has, retreated. But what you see in Detroit now today is pockets of stuff that is emerging that's beautiful, that is done very well. You're getting neighborhoods back, you're getting places back, and while there's a lot of despair still going on, you're having essentially a smaller city and a better city, like a leaner, better city coming out of this. Well, I think that's the transition we're going to have to go through, and I hope that's where we end up, is cities that are leaner and just better places to live.
Well, that's a very hopeful place to end. I think it's important to end on a hopeful lesson. So too much stuff, not enough wealth, that we should be making lots of small bets, not one big bet, and that we should have smaller, better cities. And of course, if we take the history of the city in any continental culture, the first cities, what was thought of as the city as the polis, in the Greek city-states or in what's now Iraq or in northwest India, they were remarkably small by the standards of what we now mean by the city, but they were still cities indubitably in how they worked. Charles, Chuck, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I would love to go on. I hope we can talk again. I'm going to plug your book shamelessly. I'm not on commission, just so everyone knows. Here it is, Strong Towns. I don't think there's many bookshelves in this shops in this country, but it is available online. And it's a really good read. One of my heroes, Janet Sadiq Khan, who Charles has mentioned, I think, the author of Street Fight, the deputy mayor of New York, she said it was a must-read for mayors, city builders, urbanists, and all of us who want to live in and create stronger, more vibrant and inclusive places. And I think smaller, better cities is probably a good match for that. So, Charles, thank you very much. As you all know, to leave the session, you have to press the little red button on the bottom left of your screen. And I'll just perhaps give a last word to Charles. Thank you so much, Charles.
Let's make a goal to do this in person next year. I think that would be beautiful.
That would be beautiful. And on that happy note, thank you, Charles, and thank you everyone for listening. And that is the end of this session. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.